Once again, this is the final session of the South Asia Diaspora Convention 2013. I hope you've all enjoyed our wonderful sessions and our panels. I'd like now to announce the arrival of the Deputy Prime Minister of the Republic of Singapore, Tharman Shanmugaratnam. Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore, Tharman Shanmugaratnam. Welcome, DPM. Now, we want to get started with this final session. As I mentioned, it's been a very exciting, very stimulating 2 days at the South Asia Diaspora Convention. I hope you've all enjoyed it. This is the last ministerial dialogue of the day. And I'd like to introduce onto the stage the chair of the session, as well as the panelists on this session. Give them a few minutes to settle in. And we've also got to get them mic'd up as well, so you can hear them. That's very important. So I think first up, I'd of course like to invite onto the stage someone who needs no introduction to you all, Singapore's Ambassador at Large, Professor Tommy Koh, who will chair this session. Professor Koh, if you'd like to come to the stage. A big round of applause, please. Followed by Mr. Gopalakrishnan. Thank you. Oh, bear with us, we still have to get them all mic'd up. Yes. And Mr. Anand Mahindra. Dr. Iftekhar Chowdhury, and of course, finally, the Deputy Prime Minister, who just needs a few minutes of being mic'd up. We have Mr. Gopalakrishnan. A round of applause, please. Of course, this is a session on global connections and an economic vision for the region. And finally, we have our Deputy Prime Minister. A big round of applause. Thank you, sir. I shall now hand over the chair to our very wonderful chairman, Professor Tommy Koh.
Have you been mic'd up? Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Is it on? On. I'd like to thank my good friends, Ambassador Gopinath Pillay and Professor Tan Tai Yong, for giving me this privilege of moderating the final panel. I would like to thank all of you for staying with us till the conclusion. This is a very strong panel, and I have great pleasure in introducing each of my colleagues in turn. Let me tell you what the rules are. The keynote speaker for this panel is Deputy Prime Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam. I've invited him to speak to us for about 10 minutes, and I've then introduced the other 3 speakers on the panel, each of whom will be given 5 to 7 minutes. We want this to be a very interactive panel, so we will keep the opening remarks short, so there will be maximum time for the interactive section. I just want to say this is also the final session, so I hope this will also be a wrap-up session. So apart from discussing the the topic that Gopi has assigned to us, let's also use this to wrap up the two-day convention. The three words that I've heard repeatedly in the last 2 days are diaspora, connectivity, and integration. So I guess we want to look at how we can encourage the countries of South Asia to better connected to one another and better connected to the other regions and beyond, to ASEAN, to Northeast Asia and beyond. We want to see how we can encourage the countries of South Asia to embark on the journey of economic integration in a way that the ASEAN countries have. And then we want to look at what positive role can the diaspora play in both the enhancement of the connectivity and the integration of South Asia. Let me now briefly say Deputy Prime Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam has already been introduced to you, but I want to just say a few things about him. He is our Deputy Prime Minister, our Minister of Finance. He is at the same time the Chairman of the International Monetary and Finance Committee of IMF. And I want to say that he is a Singapore leader who is both highly respected and much loved in Singapore. So DPM, you have the floor.
Thank you, the deeply respected and much loved Professor Tommy Koh. I mean that, by the way. First, I think Tommy has made quite a serious mistake. I was not meant to give address of any sort, keynote or otherwise, but I've learned from past experience to just follow Tommy's instructions. I suppose I could say a few words before my esteemed fellow panelists take over. This being the final session of the conference, and I think an extremely successful one, I should perhaps say a few things about the opportunities for those in the diaspora and the opportunities for everyone around the region to participate in South Asia's growth, as well as to increase integration between South Asia and Southeast Asia. The broad challenge is in fact similar in South Asia and Southeast Asia, and quite different, I would say, to that in China. China has had a problem of overinvestment, or more precisely, increasingly inefficient investment in the last 5 to 7 years, whereas South Asia and Southeast Asia still have a challenge of underinvestment in both the public and private sectors. There are many reasons for this, but the reasons do not have much to do with cyclical conditions, although that's what very often the financial media will focus on, whether the current account deficit is going up or down, short-term volatilities, and so on and so forth. The fundamental challenges are really of a structural nature. And indeed, I would say, not just for these emerging market economies, but globally, the fundamental challenges of a structural nature in the United States, in Japan, in Germany and Europe, even in the more successful of the advanced countries. The fundamental challenges of a structural nature, and they cannot be solved through traditional macroeconomic policies, and in particular, monetary policy. We are at risk of seeing the consequences of monetary policy overreach in the advanced countries in particular, with the consequence that there's less attention being paid by politicians, by Congress, by parliaments, on the imperative of structural reform. And this is true all over the world, and certainly true in the advanced world, but in the emerging world especially, where we don't have the liberty of being financed by the rest of the world automatically, even if there are problems at home. especially in the emerging world, we have to refocus on structural reforms, the structural imperatives that are holding back investment. We know what the big opportunities are in South Asia, India certainly, and I would say in Southeast Asia. If you look at the large Southeast Asian countries, there is still a very significant opportunity to raise productivity in agriculture and to move people away from subsistence agriculture into cities where you can have specialization, you can have clusters, but they have to be livable cities, critically. There are many policy reforms required in this regard, but there's also opportunity for private investors. There are some experiments, I understand, from speaking to businesses. For instance, in India, in Punjab, I understand it is now possible to aggregate land holdings so as to be able to invest in agriculture more efficiently. And that's critical because getting the excessively large mass of Indians who are engaged in subsistence farming at very low levels of income into cities where they can get involved in manufacturing and various other urban activities at a higher level of productivity and therefore incomes is the most important developmental challenge in India. China has gone through more of that, is further along the development path of moving people out of low productivity agriculture into the cities, but even in China, that is still the central challenge, So, land reform, particularly allowing for aggregation of land and improvements in agricultural productivity is a central challenge. But more interesting from the point of view of investors and the diaspora is what can be done to attract people into the cities and to raise standards of living. What can be done by way of on the part of investors to engage in public-private sector collaborations that can provide good jobs and to allow investment to spur development on an inclusive basis in India, in Indonesia, across these two regions. And there's ample scope for that. There's no lack of scope to develop the urban amenities that attract people into an urban environment. Water, sanitation, electricity, decent housing, all the urban amenities that can attract people into the cities. Second, very importantly, and I think this is where India has got more of a gap relative to Southeast Asia, and even more so relative to China, is the opportunity of developing export manufacturing. That is very much within India's comparative advantage, given the size of its labor force, given wage levels, and given potential skill levels with appropriate vocational and skills training. It is very much in India's comparative advantage. And there's no way in which IT services or services generally can generate the number of jobs for a very large bulge of young persons in the population who are going to be moving into the labor force. Manufacturing, and in particular export manufacturing, because it's export manufacturing that provides the strongest learning opportunities, the strongest learning curve opportunities, is a real opportunity for India. Bangladesh has done it in textiles and clothing, some other areas, and this is an area which is clearly an opportunity in India. What are the enablers? And again, these are enablers which require both public and private sector involvement. Education and skills is first and foremost, by far. This can either be a huge dividend or a huge disaster, the moving of a very large young population into the working age. And I think it can be a dividend. Yes, I think the skills development initiative in India is progressing well, but it's still early stages. And it requires creative public sector partnerships to make this work. India's starting position fiscally is quite different from China and quite different from many in Southeast Asia. It's got a fiscal challenge. It's got to reduce its fiscal deficits. So some of the old means of financing education and skills and old means of financing infrastructure are not easily available in an Indian context. So we have to find every way of involving private investors who need a decent return on their investments, but who also have a sense of public mission. We've got to find every way of incentivizing this, both within each country, but as well as from foreign investors. I think that's a real challenge, but a real opportunity. So education and skills, critical enabler. Second, infrastructure, as I just mentioned, critical enabler, again requiring public sector and private sector collaboration. Thirdly, public sector, I think there is a need to liberalize labor rules in India. That's somewhat unique to India, but also shared in Indonesia and some other economies, where labor market rigidities don't encourage hiring of workers. And that's a very important area of reform that the private sector can't do too much about, but it's really a public sector responsibility. And finally, financial liberalization. Financial liberalization that can, firstly, spur investments without causing further drains on the public purse. And there are ways in which we can improve on PPP frameworks to allow the private sector to play a leading role in funding infrastructure in particular. But secondly, it's also about funding startups, funding SMEs, funding innovation. That innovation ecosystem that has to grow both in South Asia and Southeast Asia is a real opportunity. And what we have learned in places like the United States and some other sub-regions of how academic ideas, research institutions' ideas are taken through to proof of concept stage via seed funding, often with the government acting as a catalyst, but with some private involvement. And next, beyond proof of concept stage to the market through VC funding. That game is still at a very early stage of development in both our regions, and I think has ample scope to grow. True risk financing, early stage risk financing, is still at a very early stage. There's some sort of mock versions of it, but very little true early stage risk financing, and that too is important. And that's in some ways a very exciting piece of the opportunity, because there is talent, there are ideas, there are people who are willing to get into startup enterprises, but we need to have the financial ecosystem to support it. So I suppose I should stop there if I've performed adequately, Tommy. Just to mention a few key issues which could interest the diaspora, but which are national challenges, which are also regional and cross-regional opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dipura. Thank you. I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his remarks. I would sum up his contribution in the following 3 points. First, he said to us that the fundamental challenges of the world economy today are structural in nature. I think this is a point that he repeatedly made wearing his IMF hat. His second point is to draw attention to a global trend, a trend of urbanization. And it's happening in South Asia, it's happening in Northeast Asia, happening in South Asia. But he highlighted the fact that the process of urbanization in South Asia creates many opportunities for the private sector, which can participate in a PPP framework in the transport, housing, other urban infrastructure. And his third point is to urge our friends in South Asia to consider embracing export-led manufacturing. And he said that in order to make this possible, South Asia needs to do 3 things. Augment its education and training of its human personnel, to deregulate the economy, and to enhance its financial system. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce the next speaker, an old friend, Anand Mahindra, Still looks like a movie star, Anand. Anand, I don't know why Gopi asked me to mention that he's a graduate of both Harvard College and Harvard Business School. But he's currently the chairman and managing director of the Mahindra Group, one of the leading conglomerates in India. And I'm sorry to embarrass you, Anand, but 2 years ago, the Fortune magazine listed you as one of the 25 most influential business leaders of Asia. Anand, you have the floor.
DPM, it looks like all of us are expected to give keynote speeches today. I'm not even halfway as prepared as you are. But ladies and gentlemen, from long experience, I have learned that the best panels are those where every panelist starts out with a perspective on the topic for discussion that is completely different from each other panelist. And I want to tell you that in the brief meeting we had before this, we have that promising situation today. All of us have a very different view of what we are meant to talk about, which I think is going to augur well for a lively discussion. So let me tell you, Tommy, what I read with the discussion. Initially, I saw the title and it was about Asia and about connectedness and about the economy. And then I read what followed, the paragraph that elaborated, and it talked about how the diaspora could help bring about connectivity, could help bring about greater economic uplift. What is their role? And then I realized we're at a conference which is also entitled the South Asian Diaspora. So essentially I threw out all my notes, which I had earlier brought on the economy, and I realized I had to think out of the box and completely, in a sense, reimagine what this conversation today was going to be about. And I have to tell you, what came to my aid was a very serendipitous encounter yesterday, right outside here, with a batch of students from the Global Indian School. And they just came up, their faculty members came up and said they wanted to say hello. And I had an intriguing conversation with them when I asked them where they were from. They were all children of expats, people who they were all born in Singapore or born elsewhere and then had come here. And when I asked them, what does India mean to you? Because we were going into a panel about reimagining India, and they said it means home, which at first sounded counterintuitive to me, because many of them hadn't been to India. They had traveled all over. And it was fascinating to me that it still was a concept that drew them together and which they identified as home. And I asked them if they were proud to be Indian, and again, unhesitatingly said yes, which is very different from what the situation was 20 or 30 years ago when I went to college in the US, when people were embarrassed to admit they were Indians. We were the country that couldn't feed ourselves. And I remember I gave the example in yesterday's panel, and to those youngsters, that the legendary lead singer of the band Queen was from a Parsi from Mumbai, but hid that very, very cleverly all through his life. He was embarrassed to say he was Indian. And yet the whole situation had changed. And then I began to realize, and I told them, I said, you're like the X-men or X-men and women, you're mutants. You're very different. Something is different in your genes. They do inhabit a country, but it's a country that's virtual. It's a country that's in the cloud somewhere. It's a wonderful term that allows us to morph that to the discussion here. And all of you remember, all of us have heard that song by John Lennon, Imagine, the very cheesy lyrics, which we all sang in harmony. The lyrics never really convinced us. But when I thought about these kids, imagine a world where there's no countries. People live in peace. And that is a real potential for a diaspora. Because I remember that when I was abroad in the US and I met Pakistanis or Bangladeshis, the commonality was so striking. We loved the same things. We loved the same food, we listened to the same music, we loved Urdu shairi. And the differences became ludicrous. It was almost futile to think of the sovereignty differences that our governments were contending with. So they do occupy a very different space. It's a completely different landscape. And therein, I think, lies the potential for the diaspora. In India, we have something called the Pravasiya Bharatiya Divas, which is about NRIs, non-resident Indians, and we have a gathering for them every year. But I don't think it has the power of this convention, because that is limited to the Indian diaspora. And I think it's curtailed sometimes by our stereotypical views of a diaspora and what they're meant to do. Sometimes we look at them simply as a cash cow. We love their remittances, the invisibles, as our economy tells us. We look forward to their invisibles, remittances which help us balance our budgets. There's so much more they can do. And I was in a wonderful discussion with you, Ambassador Pillai, last night at dinner, where you were telling me about the next initiatives you have, which are to try and bring different states in Pakistan and India together. What a brilliant idea, because the moment you say Punjab and Punjab, you remove everything, all the baggage that's associated with India and Pakistan. You begin talking pragmatically, you begin talking about trade. So when I looked at what the Asian century can be, a study that was released some time ago here, and there were three things they said has to be done. One is that you need pragmatism and policy formulation. And whenever you've got state-to-state dialogue, pragmatism inevitably takes a back seat. But when you have dramatis personae from the diaspora in a region talking to each other, I dare say pragmatism will come center stage. You need mutual trust was the second requirement for creating an Asian century. Well, there was trust at our table last night. We had a Pakistani gentleman at the other end. We had a Bangladeshi gentleman right next to me. I sensed no hostility. I sensed huge pragmatism. And I sensed there could be trust created by encounters such as the one last night. And finally, to build an Asian century, you need governance and institutions. And to me, that's the crux of this, that the diaspora with its wealth, 70 million almost, I believe, and with their extreme wealth, can help create institutions which are sorely lacking. I've recently become the head of something called the Public Health Foundation of India, and we are looking around for support to create a much needed public health infrastructure. And after coming here, I'm inspired to say, I think the diaspora could play a big role, because they are the ones who can help create institutions for us. So what we need is not foreign direct investment, we need foreign direct ideas. And that's where the diaspora can help. So I leave this very, very emboldened, because I think, Ambassador Pillai, what you've created is a remarkable convention that uses the convening power of Singapore. If you take the construct of the diaspora as a new entity that is like a country in the cloud, but without all the age-old boundaries that normal, conventional, geography-constrained countries have, and you give them a convening center in a country like Singapore, which is seen as neutral, which can convene dialogues like this. India and Pakistan know there is no vested interest for this in Singapore, but we are both very, very suspicious when Western powers try to convene dialogues between us. So there's this extraordinary convening power that you have to help make this country in a cloud a reality. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank Anand for his remarks. His most important point is that the diaspora can contribute to South Asia, not just investment, not just knowledge, but also ideas. And he approves of Gopi's suggestion of bringing the two Punjabs together to meet in Singapore. I would now like to introduce the next speaker, who's, I think, quite a legend in India, Mr. S Gopalakrishnan, who is the current president of the Confederation of Indian Industry, and who, together with Mr. Narayana Murthy and 5 others, these were the Magnificent 7 who co-founded Infosys in 1981. And as you know, Infosys has become a company of global repute. I would like to invite Mr. Gopalakrishnan to give us a few minutes of inspiring insights.
Good afternoon, everyone. I also have to keep our agreement of giving you a third perspective That's what we decided outside. To me, the vision for South Asia, Southeast Asia, would start from the potential, which all of you know. I think we have talked about it many times in terms of the shifting the center of gravity towards Asia, the consumer base that we have, the size of the population, the aspirational nature of the people in terms of becoming better, doing better, contributing more, looking at how through individual efforts they can actually create a better world for their own family, for their community, for their society, and for this region. So that's the opportunity that we have, that's the vision that we have, and that's why the entire world is today looking at this region. Now, in order to make that happen, and the diversity is significant in terms of there are some common history, heritage, etc. But when you look at hard facts like literacy, human development index, per capita income, the industries that we specialize in, etc., there are significant differences. And when there are significant differences, actually things take time. And so, in order to make this easier, and that's where I am going to focus on, we need to start with a lot more people to people interaction. We need to look at a lot more business to business interaction, trade. We need to look at what other factors that we can, what other factors which we can leverage in order to bring lot more connectivity and closeness. And we also need to look at how we can leverage technology and how we can leverage the 21st century opportunities in order to make these connections indeed happen. So, when I look at people to people, there is a significant opportunity. Anand talked about the diaspora and the students he met. I think educational exchanges, internship possibilities across national boundaries, easier movement of people, looking at can we have easier visas, can we have maybe for tourist and business purposes to start with, or student exchanges, can we look at mechanisms to sponsor students by industry, by businesses, etc., in larger numbers. So, that is on the people to people side, and of course, we need to have platforms where we can have cultural exchanges, cultural shows and things like that, and yesterday we saw some of that actually in the evening. So, that from the people to people side, if I then move to trade, and in order for trade to happen, we need to look at the strengths and the weaknesses of each of these countries, and how can we leverage those in order to look at how we can increase trade. So, for example, when we look at Singapore and look at the vocational training, the skills, the R&D base that is here, how can that be leveraged for the region? Or when we look at India and then look at the strengths that we have created in the IT services space, and more importantly, the massive retraining program that industry has created, where we train upwards of 1 lakh means 100,000 students actually every year to move from every branch of engineering to software engineering. So, how can we leverage these strengths that exist in order to benefit each other? Together with this, we should also look at standards, and can we have more cooperation or harmonization of these standards, mutual recognition of professional qualifications, looking at how we can enable professionals to practice across national boundaries. The traditional 20th century view is that people stay where they are most of their life, whereas in the 21st century all of us move around a lot more, and we need to rethink some of these elements actually, and we can make a start here in this region. Connectivity becomes very, very important, not just air connectivity, but land connectivity. And I was part of flagging off the Asian car rally here, and Mahindra supplied all the vehicles for that. And it's a good actually illustration of the land connectivity that exists, but how are we leveraging that, and how are we making it easier for people and goods to move across these these countries, and that I think is very, very important. From the physical connectivity, we need to look at technology. Now technology allows you to connect across the world today with no boundaries actually. But then when you move to how do you leverage the technology to provide commerce, I feel that we have a long way to go. Sitting in Singapore, you can actually produce some let's say a garment or a toy or something like that, and then you can sell to somebody in, let's say, Bangladesh or Pakistan. But the minute that you start shipping that physically, you need to worry about how many laws you break in terms of customs rules or tariffs and things like that. So how can we work together to make that easy to happen, make that simple to happen, and how can we make this, leverage this technology to promote remote education, virtual classrooms, that the 21st century opportunities and things like that. And lastly, then we need to look at entrepreneurship, innovation, new ideas, new thinking, etc. We need this in the 21st century because demographics is also very different across these countries. Some countries have an aging population, some countries have a young population. So the services that these countries would require, and not just the services but financing when people retire, all these things will need to be addressed, and I see these as opportunities for new thinking and new ideas for us to build new connections and work together. So when I look at the opportunity or the contribution the diaspora can make, it is in terms of bringing people together, encouraging our national governments to build the physical infrastructure, look at because all of us are in different professions, how can we bring our professions together to address the issue of movement of professionals across national boundaries and the ability to practice across national boundaries, because you're there, each day you're in a different country, different place. Look at soft connectivity and look at trade, commerce in the internet era in the 21st century, and address the issue of support for the elderly, which all of us will need to address. And also look at sharing the research, the capabilities, the innovation capabilities, and the entrepreneurship capabilities that exist across these countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I thank Mr. Gopalakrishnan for his remarks. He has emphasize the importance of enhancing education exchange, internships, and a freer movement of people between the countries of South Asia and between South Asia and other regions in Asia. He's also emphasized the importance of enhancing capacity building, and he talked about the need to enhance vocational or technical education, the need to train more IT people in India and South Asia. He's also talked about the importance of connectivity in all the modes of transport, land, air, sea, and digital, and expressed some frustration that digital commerce cannot take off in South Asia because there are many physical and regulatory obstacles. I would now like to introduce our final speaker on this panel, Dr. Iftekhar Chowdhury, who is a member of the Institute of South Asian Studies. Dr. Chowdhury was a very distinguished member of the Bangladesh Foreign Service. He had served as permanent representative of Bangladesh to the United Nations, both in Geneva and in New York. And when he was in New York, he held some leadership positions in the UN. During the interim government between 2007 and 2009, he served as the Foreign Minister of Bangladesh. So it's a great pleasure for me to invite Dr. Chowdhury to share some remarks with us.
Thank you, Chairman, Deputy Prime Minister, ambassadors. It would be frightfully remiss of me were I to begin my substantive remarks without thanking ISAS and ISAS leadership for making it possible for me to be here and share these thoughts with you. I'm able to share this frankly, I think, today, but time was when Ambassador Koh and I were in diplomacy 100 years ago. We used to believe that speech was given to the diplomat to conceal his thoughts. But today, I am a researcher and able to think and share thoughts freely. I also would like to stress the fact that before I address my remarks, the fact that I am myself individually quintessentially South Asian. I was born in Assam, British India. I was bred in Pakistan. I served professionally in Bangladesh. And finally have come here to Singapore, where all good South Asians eventually end up. The topic that I wish to address is something a bit out of the box, but related to what we've been talking over the last 2 days. And I call it trilateralism. Trilateralism between the three ethoses that I myself have shared: India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. The three largest countries in this subcontinent, region. Time was when they formed a single entity as a part of British India, shared many common experiences. Today, the pluralist values of their people make them three of the largest democracies in the world. However, unfortunately, certain colonial legacies have fed some, and this is an irony, some conflict into the intramural relationship. And today, alas, we are known for not necessarily our amity, but animosity among us. This, despite the camaraderie that we see abroad among our diaspora, that we've seen in the corridors over the past 2 days that we see, and Ambassador Koh mentioned my relationship with the United Nations. I've been there for many years. I've worked very closely with other subcontinental countries on peacekeeping, and we see our soldiers of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh share in Africa, in Congo, in Burundi, and Cote d'Ivoire. So, what can we do? There is also, of course, an existing structure that of which all three are members, and this is SADC. But we have seen over the past 2 days discussions on how SADC confronts so many inadequacies, suffers from so many inadequacies. Very quickly to analyze them. One is because, unlike other international organizations, there are too many bureaucratic layers in legislative layers in SADC before decisions or documents reach the political masters. We have a committee of joint secretaries, then ministers, and thereafter heads of government, whereas most international organizations have senior officials and political masters. As a result, when issues come to the political masters, their hands are very often tied. All decisions have to be by consensus, number two. And number three, no contentious issues can be discussed. Unsurprisingly, there has been very little forward movement. So what I'm going to propose is an idea of an informal structure between just the heads of the three countries, three governments. And they would meet in a very informal setting, would not be constrained by bureaucratic documents. Issues between the three countries would be categorized into green, orange, and red boxes in accordance with in the pecking order of their complexities. And these issues could be identified by a group of eminent persons, and we know that there is no dearth of this kind of intellectual capital, these kind of intellectual resources in South Asia. The heads would address the low-hanging fruits first, and eventually graduate to more difficult topics. It would be a top-down rather than a bottom-up approach. The idea would not be to supplant SADC, by the way, but to buttress it, to strengthen it. Eventually, if the core develops, it could spread to the other countries in the SADC. Just as the European Union, as we all know, began with the inner six and gradually expanded to cover others in the region. This group could, say for example, take decisions on what the Deputy Prime Minister urged us to do, devise methodologies how investments could be attracted, how to, we could set up, for instance, a bank, a South Asian diaspora bank fund, in order to devise instruments in order to be able to divert investments from the diaspora into the region and allocate them in a way that they get the maximum kind of return from these. So this is just an idea. We have heard in many of these sessions here that a cooperative relationship between the two countries would enhance the GDP of the region by over 2%. These are very large countries, ladies and gentlemen. These are not the countries like when Mr. Chidambaram was talking of comparing with peers. There are many countries in the world where if you catch a large fish, the GDP doubles immediately. But none of these three countries are like that. These are very, very large countries. So this huge market coming together would create a tremendous advantage for the peoples. Of course, as we have heard, India would have to play a disproportionate role. It is the largest. It has the most resources. It should be perceived as the elder and not just the big brother. As India rises, my belief is Pakistan and Bangladesh would follow in a flying geese pattern, flying geese formation, drawing strength from the flapping of the wings of the lead nation. Our people know, the people of Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India know that if there is a hill to climb, waiting will not make it any smaller. This trilateralism could be the new South Asian dream, the foundation of a new South Asian home. It will require, of course, a change of mindset. And yes, it will be difficult. Yes, it will be uncertain. But yes, it will be worth a try. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I thank Iftekhar for that very interesting suggestion that in order to accelerate progress in SADC, there should be an inner caucus of the three countries, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. So I'd like to hear some comments or questions based on all the four presentations. Could we have the lights on in the room, please? Yes, please. We have about 15 minutes, so I suggest we take two to three questions at a time. Yeah, please.
Hi, thank you for a very inspiring set of remarks. Christian Eigenzuki with the World Bank, but speaking as a German and as a European, I just wanted to share.
Dr. Bert Kaufman is the head of the World Bank office in Singapore.
Just wanted to share an example from Germany and France. No doubt it's been a long journey from animosity to very close ties now. But one part of that, I think, was the establishment of a joint history commission that would review the curricula that were used to teach history of, a common history in Europe, and would be used on both in France and in Germany. Perhaps something like that could work in South Asia to review the history, because without having a common understanding of history, perhaps it's hard to envision a new future, and the next generation might then be able to take a different tack.
Thank you very much, Bert. I had been urging my Chinese and Japanese friends to emulate France and Germany, but I have no success up to now. Another question, please. Another question. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Suresh Agrawal from Infotech. I think this was really an interesting panel, and my question is to Mr. Gopalakrishnan. And I think I want to just say a few words in the background. I think we heard from the Deputy Prime Minister earlier that there was a way, there was a capital inadequacy, and there was a possibility of capital to be flown in India. I think Mr. Mahindra did point out that there is a strong desire of people living in diaspora outside. They don't see a difference between Indian, Pakistani or Bangladeshi, and they just live like friends. And then I think we heard from Professor Rizvi earlier how the opening of border between India and Bangladesh has really helped. My question to you, sir, and to basically to the High Commissioners and other people sitting in the room is, why can't we just open the border totally? I think we also heard the Deputy Prime Minister at the opening session, the border should be normal, like the one between Singapore and Malaysia. So why can't we just take the perspective of the diaspora to say that how countries have really opened up? I was a little bit worried when I saw a very cautious approach on saying that let's open up for students, let's just open up for everybody. Let people travel. And I don't think people will kill each other. I think people will love to mingle with each other. We all had experience over dinner. We were sitting with people of different countries, and nobody had any desire to hurt anybody else. And I think if we can just open up the borders.
Okay, thank you. Since the first two questions are such simple ones, maybe I say that ironically. Maybe we can have a third question, please. Microphone, please, in the front here. So question one is, why can't we have a joint history commission? Two, why can't we open up all the borders? And yes?
So this question is for the DPM. We heard today whole day that biggest issue in the economic development in this region is the relationship or the lack of it between India and Pakistan. All the speakers also agreed that if India and Pakistan collaborated together, the economic dividends are immense. So my question is that Singapore occupying such a neutral position, is there a role for Singapore that Singapore can play in bringing these two things together?
I take it that your question addressed to DPM. Yeah. So let me ask each member of the panel to answer the three questions, or any of them, beginning with DPM, and then I go to Anand, and then to Mr. Gopalakrishnan, then Iftekhar.
So DPM, I think, first of all, a country of Singapore's size, in every sense of the term, has to be realistic about what it can achieve in resolving major issues of history between much larger societies. However, one of the interesting things about the world is how sometimes being small and neutral and of no threat to any of the parties can be an advantage with regard to bringing a meeting of minds, because you have no vested interest in any sense, political, economic, strategic. And I think the best way to go about this, therefore, is to do it with some modesty, never overreach ourselves, and to do it not necessarily at, well, in fact, not at the G to G level,
track one,
but through what diplomats called track two or track three. And starting with the think tanks, starting with the academic and civil society establishments, is to me, I think, the most useful way of going about it. But do it with some humility, because these are clearly complex issues and multi-dimensional, and there's very little scope for Singapore to actually point directions as much as simply providing a neutral venue and to have a spirit of conviviality that can help to inform progress. So that's all I would say. But secondly, if I could just make a point very briefly, I would not, thinking about how things have evolved in Southeast Asia and in East Asia generally, where there's no lack of historical rivalries and problems, some new ones emerging as well. I would not underestimate the role of private sector supply chains in industry and in services, in making people more comfortable with each other, and importantly, giving countries a vested interest in each other's stability and prosperity. The world used to be a place where you each export to markets and compete with each other in global markets based on production within your country. Today, comparative advantage is not about individual cities and countries, but about clusters of cities and about regional comparative advantage. So you talk about the Asian supply chain in electronics manufacturing, for instance, which is still evolving. It's still fluid, but it is an Asian supply chain. It's not a Singapore supply chain. It's not, by the way, a China supply chain, because most electronics production in China has most of the value being created somewhere along the way elsewhere in Asia and to some extent in the advanced countries. So integration of supply chains across countries and across cities provides a sense of a common stake in each other's stability and prosperity. And I wouldn't underestimate the importance of this market-driven private sector supply chains in being part of the solution to what are obviously far more complex problems.
DPM, isn't that a role that a diaspora can play?
I
Where there's economic logic, a diaspora investor can capture the different comparative advantages of different countries in South Asia.
I would think so, but I think our fellow panelists...
So let's go to Anand.
Yes, on the last question, when I think you were asked by the questioner whether Singapore could play a role, I saw a lot of heads shaking cynically that no, it couldn't. But let me just share an anecdote about Drew Faust, the president of Harvard University. When she took over as president, I happened to be hosting a dinner in her honor in Davos, and there were a bunch of very feisty alumni around the table, and they were telling her that, you know, you need to do this, you need to do that, and they said, why isn't Harvard taking the lead in climate change? And she stepped back and said something which I've carried to this day. I think it sounds simple, but it's profound. She said, you know, there are many things Harvard does, but I think the role of a university is not necessarily to take a position on everything, but to start a conversation and to be a locus of conversation. And I find that philosophy applies to many things. I believe it applies to Singapore too. So what we are looking to you for is not necessarily a solution to the problem, but I think Singapore is in a unique place to ignite conversations.
To be the catalyst.
And so, Ambassador, I think that's what you've done with this conference. You started an enormous conversation. You started a conversation between me and Mr. Dawood at dinner yesterday from Pakistan. There are myriad, there are multiple conversations going on. So I think that's where more of these conversations, as opposed to Singapore stepping back and saying this is not our role, I think you can step forward here and say, yes, it is our role to spark conversation. That alone will have benefit. Coming back to Bert, you talked about the History Commission. I have to say, you know, there's this phrase in business, low-hanging fruit. Somehow I think getting Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis to sit and start talking about joint history is not a low-hanging fruit. That's probably a low-hanging minefield. You know, we'll probably we can't even agree on what the maps of our countries look like. I'm afraid we'll be talking for the next century. Yeah. I think trade is a low-hanging fruit. And a conversation about trade is far easier than debating history, although I agree with you that that's right. And the other gentleman, of course, when you started talking about opening up the borders, there were polite noises of laughter as to how, you know, sort of utopian that sound. But I think I'm going to institute a John Lennon Prize for today. You get the John Lennon Prize. You keep imagining it. Someday it will happen. I agree with you.
Mr. Gopalakrishnan, any comment on any of the three questions?
Well, let me also attempt to answer this question of open borders actually. See, we need to separate you know, short duration travel versus immigration. In the 20th century, most of the laws were made for immigration. When people moved, people assumed that they would come and settle down and take resources from the new country, you know, pension or retirement funds or social infrastructure that is available, etc. And that's what is afraid, because you have not paid tax and suddenly you come and enjoy the benefits. But in the 21st century, we are really talking about short duration travel, maybe a day here, day there. And a lot of us, you know, this is one of the frustrating things I have. You know, I won't name the countries actually, and I say I go there 4 times this year, and each time I get a 1-month visa. So I have to apply 4 times in a year to just go to that country again and again. I think we need to, and I think because we are all still in the 20th century and looking at what used to happen, and it still happens. So how do we separate these, and how do we understand the differences and the need for a lot more flexibility and ease? I think that's what is needed. And how to make it happen, I think we need people like the Deputy Prime Minister from the government side to, I think, figure this out actually.
Our German friends' observation, but of course what we get from Germany, by the way, is the Westphalian system in 1648. The difference in South Asia is that you in Europe, you lived through the Westphalian system for 300 years and evolved into what Europe is today. We are having to telescope the Westphalian experience in 50 years. It's been only 50 years that these countries have been separate, identifiable countries. This is linked to what our friend asked about open frontiers. The great intellectual confusion among us is that we do not know whether to stress our commonalities or to stress our differences. We do not know where East Punjab ends and West Punjab begins. We do not know where Bengal ends and Bangladesh begins. So this is a confusion that we need to resolve. Yet, I would be on the optimistic side and say that as of now, already the time is that ideas should be able to flow freely now, and the rest will follow eventually.
Thank you. Actually, I disagree. I would defend Bert and say that we shouldn't blame the Westphalian system for the inability of Asians to come to terms with their past. China and Japan are two great countries that have existed for not just centuries but millennia. And when you compare the inability of Japan and China to put history behind them and to go forward in amity and compare the journey that our European friends have taken, we should be ashamed of ourselves, you know? So we shouldn't blame Westphalia. We should blame ourselves.
We're not blaming it, we're saying that.
Yeah. So I just want to make one more remark. I agree with DPM and Anand that Singapore can play a modest role, especially on track 2, in encouraging cooperation, mutual trust among the peoples of South Asia. And one of my good friends, an NGO leader, Melissa Kui, had already done this in the past. She brought university students from India and Pakistan to spend a summer in Singapore. They lived together in the United World College. Her agenda is nothing more than to encourage students from these two great countries to live together for the summer, talk to each other, try to reduce their mutual distrust and increase their mutual trust. I completely support Gopi and Taeyong's intention to bring the people from the two Punjabs here, the Punjabis from Pakistan and Punjabis from India. And when that is over, Gopi and Taeyong, I hope you also bring the Bengalis from West Bengal and Bangladesh, and so on and so on. Can we just take 3 more questions before we wrap up? Professor Mooney here, lady in the back. We'll take all the questions, and two people here. Okay, there are 4 questions, so let's hear from all of them. Professor Mooney first.
Thank you. I have a short observation and a question. The observation is related to India-Pakistan. We all welcome very noble emotions that these two countries must get together, and many people have been trying for that. But it is not for the lack of either track 2 or the communication channels between the two countries. Rajiv promised a solution to Pakistan of the Siachen problem. He came back and his own stakeholders in the country said, no, you can't do it. Benazir Bhutto, Zardari, and now Nawaz Sharif, they all want to get very close to India, at least in economic relations. And they have their stakeholders. I don't want to say army, but would not let them do what they really want to do. So the problem is internally within these countries. Their own ideas, ideologies, histories, animosities, whatever else it is. And from this arises the question to Dr. Chowdhury, that your idea or proposal of the 3 countries caucus is great, but will they be able to sustain the decisions which they take at the caucus within their own respective countries?
Thank you. Lady in the back, please. And then the 2 other questions. Yeah, please.
Hi, my name's Lara. I'm here supporting a social enterprise called
Can you speak louder? I can't hear you.
My name's Lara Dudley, and I'm here supporting a social enterprise called Milab. And just firstly, I'd like to thank the organisers here for putting on a really, really great conference. First of all, I have a comment to build upon what the Deputy Prime Minister said, and then lastly, I have a question. The Deputy Prime Minister was talking about cross-regional innovation, and I just wanted to talk about the role that Singapore has played and my observations of the role that Singapore has played in that in terms of 3 areas: education, investment, the risk financing that you're talking about, and thirdly, in terms of ecosystem building. Milab is a social enterprise that I've just started helping out, and it was started by 3 Indians, 2 of which are actually NUS alumni. And they came up with a social enterprise idea that went through 3 years of proof of concept and has now been validated, and I believe it's been validated by it being able to raise $1.1 million in impact investment here in Singapore from impact investors.
Could you put your question, please?
Yeah, certainly. And the vision of Milab is actually to help empower individuals to do everyday good. And my question is around the challenge that social enterprises face. And how can everyone get involved, from individuals to corporates, in innovative financial models like Milab, when the problems of education, sanitation, and energy, and healthcare should traditionally people think is the role of the government and traditional philanthropy donation models.
Okay.
So it's in terms of how can you change the mindsets.
Okay, thank you. The role of social enterprise. Yeah? 2 more questions. Can you be very brief because we've run out of time? Please.
Hi, my name is Manoj. I have 2 questions. One of the
Can you just ask one?
Okay.
Ask the more important one.
Fine, yes. My question is about, here there is a representation of successful diaspora. My question is about failed diaspora, because there are many diasporas not necessarily living in Singapore or living in successful countries. There are many diaspora sometimes living poor quality than animals and trying their hard to come up. So diaspora is good, but when we're talking about good and successful diasporas, there are many people who are struggling in their countries they migrated. What is this diaspora community going to do?
Okay, thank you. Final question.
Hello.
Yes?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
My name is Kashmira, and on one hand, we've been talking about trade, we've been talking about entrepreneurship, we've been talking about cultural and academic exchanges in connecting Southeast Asia and bringing people together. But on the other hand, we still have a lot of people at an individual level or at a grassroots level where people are still struggling with issues like, say, sons of the soil or foreign...
Sorry, do you have a question?
Yeah, that's my question.
Can you cut short the preamble,
sure.
go straight to the question?
Basically, issues like foreign employment versus locals, etc.
Yeah,
so do you think that sets us back a little with our whole vision, or is it something that we can work towards? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the 4 panelists to respond in reverse order. We'll start with Dr. Chowdhury. Okay. You can pick any question you want to answer, but also use this chance to conclude your presentation today and share with the audience what is the one takeaway or inspiring thought you want them to leave this room with.
Well, there was a question directly addressed to me by Professor Mooney, so I will speak to that for a moment. Yes, I agree with you, it will be difficult. It would be difficult for the political leadership to change the system within. But as I had also noted that despite the difficulty, it is worth a try. We have already seen between India and Bangladesh how things have changed. We heard Gohar Rizvi earlier. And I can also say that as a career diplomat, 30 years, 40 years ago when we began our career, India was a completely different phenomena to us. Today, it's completely changed. The mindset of the man on the Clapham omnibus, if there's such a person in Bangladesh, is changed vis-a-vis India. Hopefully, the same will happen in Pakistan over time. Therefore, the process, then the takeaway. As we have already agreed here, the conversation has begun. Ambassador Gopinath Pillai, Professor Tan Tai Yong, and others have begun a process that we hope will gather steam as we go forward. And hence, from here on, we've talked of history. This event will go down in history as perhaps a milestone in the gathering together of the values of South Asia into one civilizing, united entity.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Gopalakrishnan.
So, let me conclude this discussion from my perspective, not directly answering these questions, but kind of giving you a directional answer. And I'm going to actually build upon Mr. Shanmugaratnam's and Anand's opening comments. Actually, I'm going to make them come together. The opportunity that exists today, and especially if I look at this room, physically, all of us are present here together. Technology today allows you, in some sense, to virtually connect, and Anand talked about this, and the new structure that is required and the structural changes which the Deputy Prime Minister talked about, I feel is the creation of a new structure. We have to remember that business organizations are not that old actually, and even nation states are not that old. With the emergence of internet and digital technology, virtual connections, etc., and you talked about social enterprises and the ability to raise finance anywhere in the world, collect people from anywhere in the world, provide solutions across the world. The need for traditional structures probably are becoming less and less. The more we travel, the need for traditional structures are becoming less and less, and the traditional structures are becoming actually hindrances for people to actually become better, and the issues of sons of soil, etc., are actually hindrances for people becoming better and things like that. So will we now come out with a new structure, a new set of organizational structures, and new formations and new groupings and new social clusters and communities which are very different? And that's something I think again the institute should also look at, I believe, because only 100 years from now or 200 years from now we look back and say this is when it started, possibly. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anand? Yeah, one quick response to Maria first about her question on social enterprise. She asked the question of how can this be brought together. There is a construct that is burgeoning right now, and that's called shared value. The shared value enterprise is where businesses try to do good and do well at the same time. CSR, in fact, is a passé idea. What is sustainable is when you make social enterprises that are sustainable. Michael Porter has called it shared value. We put that center stage as the philosophy of Mahindra. Our tagline is Rise. We have got 3 new fledgling enterprises which come under this category. They are about microfinance, home loans to rural Indians, and we are doing another one which has to do with education. So shared value is the answer to your question. And I don't have, Ambassador, my takeaway is not something I leave behind. My takeaway is something I take away. And that is from the 2 last questions that Kashmira and the gentleman before her asked. I think they brought us back to reality in a sense, that we are dealing here with the cream, so to speak, of the diaspora. But there are diaspora members who are struggling all over. And I think that, frankly, should come center stage, Ambassador Pillai, that perhaps one of the conversations we need to start is how do the diaspora that have been successful help lift up those that are still struggling? How do they make those who are in cruise liners, how do they make all the boats rise? And all I can say to you is that all the corporations, which are Asian and South Asian corporations that are transnational, work in those areas, we will be willing to help put our shoulder to the wheel and ensure that no member of the diaspora struggles anymore.
Well, I have very little to add except to say that on all the issues that we've been talking about, achieving growth, getting past underinvestment, achieving inclusive societies, very importantly, our bias has to be about translating vision into action. It's a bit of a Singapore bias, and for countries that have few choices in life, the need to translate vision into action is the key imperative. And I think that should be our whole mode of operating. Moving from values to vision, but really from vision to schemes and from schemes to action and outcomes. In that light, since Anand has already awarded the John Lennon Prize, I thought, as you were saying that, I thought I should award the Elvis Presley Prize to actually the two entrepreneurs who are on the panel, Chris and Anand, who haven't got to where they are just through vision or conversation, but through action. And they're both value-inspired people. I happen to know something about them. It's really values that inspire them. But they have succeeded in creating world-class enterprises by translating values to vision, vision to action, and to outcomes. And the Elvis Presley Prize goes to them because for those of you who are young enough to remember, there was an old song called A Little Less Conversation. A little less conversation, a little more action, please. A little more bite and a little less bark. A little less fight and a little more spark. Thank you.
Gopi, after that musical note, it will be superfluous for me to try to sum up this panel. So just thank you. Let me not fail Gopi and Taeyong by saying that it is of course true that the diaspora of about 50 to 70 million people is a heterogeneous community. Some have prospered and done well, and some have not done as well. But if you look at the South Asian diaspora in the world, one is struck by how many of them have done so well in their adopted country. And I think this South Asian diaspora in Southeast Asia and globally can do many things for South Asia. They have capital, know-how, network, ideas. They can help South Asia to grow and develop in a way that the Chinese diaspora has helped the Chinese to grow. They can help because they carry less historical baggage than their counterparts in the home country. They can encourage South Asia to become more interconnected, more integrated, to be less suspicious of one another, and to cooperate more. I think that's a role they can play. And as for Singapore, I would say that we are small, but we are neutral. We are friends of all the countries in South Asia, and in a modest way, we can play a role as convener, as catalyst, either in bringing students together to meet in Singapore, bringing Punjabis from the two Punjab, the Bengalis from Bangladesh and West Bengal, and to bring business leaders, social enterprise leaders, and so on to meet here. We can play a small but positive role to help South Asia grow, to help South Asia become more integrated, and to become a more inclusive world. Thank you very much.